Welcome to Securing Success, where we get to know the professionals that make up the cybersecurity sector. Today, we've got Marc Frankel, the CEO of Manifest, with us. Marc, glad to have you on.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Mark.
This is going to be a good conversation. In our last discussion, you gave me a rundown on Manifest and the segment of security that it addresses. And it's clearly catching the eyes of the investors, which is why I wanted to talk to you. So give the viewers a quick rundown of Manifest and the problems that it's going to be solving for the marketplace.
Sure. So Manifest is a seed stage cybersecurity company. We're focused on the problem of software supply chain visibility and transparency. And when you think about it, software is the only thing that we buy that you don't get to know what's in it. So when you buy a house, you get a home inspection. When you buy a box of cereal, it says, contains bran flakes and sugar and raisins. But when you buy Microsoft Word or Zoom or Teams or Slack or the software that comes with your HP printer or your Cisco router, it just shows up in your enterprise. You kind of hope for the best. And for the first 40 to 45 years of software, that was the acceptable status quo. So by some estimates, up to 90% of new software is cobbled together from open source and third-party components. And that's as it should be, right? That's a huge force multiplier in terms of how much software the world can produce and how quickly. If I need a line chart, I don't have to build a line chart from scratch. I can go to NPM or GitHub. I can grab a line chart and bring it into my application. The problem is the mechanisms for inventorying those third-party and open source components have not kept pace with the rapid proliferation of open source and third-party software. And so enter the idea of this thing called an SBOM, a software bill of materials. An SBOM is basically just a list of ingredients, just like you would have on the side of a box of Raisin Bran, that tell you what's inside this thing that you're about to build or that you're about to buy. And SBOMs as a concept, as an artifact, are becoming table stakes in certain industries around the world. Unfortunately, capabilities for consuming those SBOMs, making sense of these bits of JSON that tell you what are the third-party and open source components, the ability to manage and curate and analyze and extract insight into these bits of JSON, they have not. We're now at the stage where SBOMs are proliferating, but now we need tools to consume those SBOMs, and that's why we built Manifest. So the team, we're about a year and a half old. The team is fully remote and distributed. We've got customers in both the public and the private sector. And it's clear that there's a need for digesting and understanding these SBOMs. It's no longer acceptable for us to blindly be consuming software without knowing what's in it.
And so again, I think for a lot of people that aren't as familiar, that the terminology used in terms of inventorying what you're getting and associating it with that software bill of materials, that's critical because, as you referenced again, there's just an explosion in open source software or open source code.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the days of being able to push code into production in a highly regulated or mission critical enterprise without accounting for what you've added to an application, hopefully those days are coming to an end. I'll tell one quick story here, which is December 9th, 2021 was kind of the day where we knew we needed to build Manifest, and it was unfortunately the worst day in a lot of security professionals' careers. And that was the day that the Log4 shell vulnerability was announced by Sasson and NSA. And what happened was you had Log4j, which is a logging application, comes from the Apache Foundation, highly credible organization. It was found to be vulnerable. It wasn't anybody's fault. It was just a vulnerability that it was in this widely used logging application that 12 million Java developers had incorporated into their applications. And so that fundamental question of where do I have Log4j in my environment was not as simple as reading all the sides of the boxes of all of the cereals in your pantry. It was 5,000 hair on fire phone calls to all of your vendors to say, do you use Log4j? Do you use Log4j? What version are you running? Is it running the exploitable code block? Can I get an attestation? Can I get a waiver? And so those days of those hair on fire phone calls, those nobody goes home until we've reached everybody, our North Star is bringing that down to one click. If you're assiduous about inventorying all of the components and all of your applications, both the applications that you built yourself, as well as the applications that you've bought from third parties, theoretically, you ought to be one search or one alert away from understanding where do I have this component in my environment.
Now, you mentioned the announcement of the Log4j vulnerability. Was there a specific instance, a specific scenario where on that day or in the days after, people were, or an organization or something happened that was notable to really lock this down?
Yeah, so it's what's known as a 0 day, which basically means that the vulnerability is announced on the same day that there's an exploit in the wild. You have 0 days to prepare for it. And it wasn't even so much, it wasn't the case that where I was working or my co-founder Daniel was working was compromised or exploited, ransomware, et cetera. It was really the response that we saw. Even if your organization wasn't susceptible, the manual process that you had to undertake to understand whether or not you were susceptible, and none of that work is recyclable, right? It's like you make 5,000 phone calls to 5,000 vendors about 5,000 applications, and then all of that work is useless basically as soon as it's over. You still don't have an inventory of all of your open source and third-party components. You just have 5,000 individual attestations about whether or not they're affected by one particular vulnerability. There's 200,000 vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database. It's just not feasible or practical to expect that every time there's a new critical vulnerability, for instance, that a CISO or his or her team is going to go and make 5,000 phone calls all over again. And so really what this laid bare is that you wouldn't do this for anything else, right? Like if we extend out the food analogy here for a second, if there was an E. coli outbreak in raisins, you wouldn't call General Mills and Kellogg's and, Post and whoever else and say, do you have raisins? Do you have raisins? And then wait for the next E. coli outbreak and then call them and say, do you have bran flakes? Do you have bran flakes? You would demand that each one of those food manufacturers present you with a list of ingredients on the side of the box so that you could do that analysis yourself. And that's exactly where we are in the software industry today.
So interesting. And, I mentioned this sincerely when we first started, that this segment is gaining traction. And to really put that in perspective for some of the viewers, in our tracking, we recorded 6 funding rounds for supply chain oriented vendors in the past year or so. And so with this relatively new concept, at least from a general perspective, right? People like you knew about this going back a ways. That's a lot of activity really, really fast. And so I'm curious, that you're not the only one playing in the game right now, right? So knowing this, how do you differentiate Manifest? Why are buyers, and it sounds like you have some notable customers, so why are buyers choosing Manifest in this segment over the other competitors, especially given your relative early stage in the life cycle?
Yeah, it's a great question. So both my co-founder Daniel and I, we come from enterprise data analytics and cybersecurity backgrounds. We've used a lot of tools. We've been disappointed by a lot of tools. We've been frustrated by a lot of tools. One of the things that I want to give my co-founder Daniel a lot of credit for is we're really trying to solve the end-to-end workflow of an SBOM. An SBOM is a bit of JSON or XML. It's literally a file that you would download onto your computer. But the concept behind an SBOM is a workflow, right? It's how a software vendor communicates risk with a software consumer. And so I think, what we've seen in the market is a lot of point-wise solutions, right? It's like we need a software application that will generate me an SBOM in CycloneDX format, in JSON file format, and it will, do this as part of my CI/CD pipeline, et cetera. Okay, great. Then we need another tool that merges those SBOMs together. Then we need another tool that shares the SBOMs, and another tool that analyzes the SBOMs, another tool that asks our vendors for SBOMs. We're looking holistically at the entirety of the SBOM lifecycle. So cradle to grave. how do you ask your vendors for an SBOM? How do you make that the easiest thing your organization does? Acknowledging that a lot of the people who are going to be soliciting SBOMs from vendors are GRC professionals, third-party risk management folks. They're not people with cybersecurity backgrounds. So how do you put that process on rails for even non-technical people? Then once you have those SBOMs and you're generating SBOMs for your internal applications, how do you perform the analysis so that you know what you care about within the SBOM? But not just the analysis of, hey, you match to 50 vulnerabilities, but which ones of those are exploitable? Like which ones of these vulnerabilities are nice to knows versus nobody goes home until it's fixed? And I think this is not specific to software supply chain writ large. What we're seeing across the board in cybersecurity is that security professionals are overwhelmed, way overwhelmed. There are only so many tools you can look at that are shouting red triangles at you all day. There's no way to manage all of those alerts. And so there's alert fatigue. And when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So we're investing really heavily in making sure that if we alert a manifest user to something, we're only alerting them on something that they really care about, that they ought to do something about, and that we're taking as many of the steps in the remediation workflow as we can. The research on, what do I do about this? The research on where is it in my environment? The research on which of my tools need to be patched, to try to take as much of the administrative burden out of security and third-party risk management professionals as possible. And then ultimately finishing the workflow by integrating into existing enterprise ecosystems. We have an advisor who mentioned to us, they said, integration eats innovation's lunch. And that's not like the space is innovative, right? Yeah. SBOMs are new, VEX is new. A lot of this stuff is very new. But if you don't play well in the ecosystems you're deploying in, you'll always end up just being a one-off curiosity. And so making sure that we can integrate with upstream vendor management tools, downstream ticketing tools to become part of the ecosystem that our customers rely on day in and day out, as opposed to relying on them to, conform to our way of life. I would say kind of the holistic enterprise workflow view is what sets Manifest apart.
So these are really good points, and I want to summarize for some people that may not be as technically informed on this subject, right? So when we're talking about integration, these vendors that you would sell to, right? These organizations you would sell to, it sounds like what you're talking about is they've got a whole bunch of other products in there. And it would be a pain in the butt for them to go and deploy a new product that doesn't talk to all the other ones or play nice within an environment, because then they have to go make a bunch of changes and the cost to acquire Manifest is going to increase substantially.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think there was a recent study survey that came out. I think the average enterprise has something like 35 security tools. Now, like, don't quote me on that. Rough order magnitude. Yeah. Right. And every one of them professes to be the single pane of glass for whatever narrow sliver of the market they have. And, I've met a lot of people with a lot of computer monitors. I've never met anybody who has 35 computer monitors. And so ultimately for us, SBOMs are only as valuable as how easily you can extract them from your vendors and from your internal applications. And they're only as useful as the analysis that you perform on them. And the analysis is only as useful as the alerts that you create and take action on. So we're not asking somebody to throw away Splunk or ServiceNow. We're asking somebody to augment their existing Splunk and ServiceNow instances with a fundamental question of what's inside this application that I'm about to deploy in my environment.
That's really informative. Even for me, I got the concept of this. Now talking to you, it's really starting to click. So I appreciate how you're communicating this. And
sure,
my next question is more of a business one, right? I'm a small business owner. I know where my idea came from this, right? But I started in this industry. I started my business. You and your co-founder, you saw a problem. Other people saw this problem too. I bet you a lot of people saw this problem, but you're relatively one of few that actually took action to solve it. So how do you go from saying, hey, it'd be really cool if there was a tool like that to, yeah, I'm going to start a company to solve this issue? That's a huge step. What goes into that? Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, certainly hubris and naivete. When you think about it, if we think about it from the realm of like a McKinsey, case study type question, there's 8 billion people in the world. And there's probably, 1/1000th of 1% of them know what an SBOM is. And there's an even smaller fraction of those people that have experience building enterprise grade software. And so my co-founder Daniel and I looked at each other and we said, like, to borrow a line from, Josh Corman, We Are the Cavalry, like, there's nobody coming to save us, right? And by us, I mean, the world as a whole. The world needs the enterprise world, both on the public and the private sector side, need to understand what's in their software. There's no mythical person down the hall who's going to magically fix this. And so we realized it was kind of incumbent on us to build the platform that we knew that enterprises needed. Now, are there other people in the world who are credible in this space and who are really good at building software? Absolutely. Right. And, I've yet to encounter an industry where there weren't multiple solutions to a single problem. We're taking our enterprise security, data analytics, user-centric, workflow-oriented approach, and we're saying, hey, we think this is the way SBOMs ought to be solved. SBOMs ought to be managed. SBOMs ought to be disseminated, generated, solicited, analyzed, and ultimately shared. And again, if we don't do it, then who will?
So you take the leap, and then obviously you've got to fund this thing, and funding has been a bit sticky as of late, right? Funding is down about 55% in Q2, for example, of 23 versus Q2 of 22. We just put out a report on that. Mm-hmm. So was it difficult for you to go in and convince these investors to take the leap on you, invest in you, or were they enthusiastic about this idea? Were they just throwing money at you? How did that go?
I think anybody has a right to be inherently skeptical if anyone's just throwing money at people. There's a Dutch tulip example in there somewhere. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have the investors that we do. So we raised a pre-seed round with XYZ Capital, a guy named Ross Fubini, who's kind of become somewhat legendary for supporting Palantir alumni founders. And so Ross has been a mentor, a friend, a resource. Daniel and I are both first-time founders. So even down to the tactical, like, who do we use for our counsel? And, what does this term mean? And, whatever else. Having somebody who you trust as one of your investors is probably the most important thing. And so that's what allowed us to get this off the ground in May of last year, was a pre-seed round that we had done with XYZ. We spent probably the first 5 or so months deving on a prototype. We were very, very fortunate to get a couple of early design partner customers in healthcare, aerospace, the defense industrial base, defense contractor. And then really what kind of turned the tide was we ended up getting awarded a Department of Homeland Security Silicon Valley Innovation Program contract.
Nice.
So Department of Homeland Security, the Science and Technology Directorate, in partnership with CISA, to their eternal credit, realized that SBOM management was an area that needed investing in. And so they dedicated resources and they put out this, when we first read the technical solicitation, we said, like, that's literally what we're building. So we applied to it and we were fortunate enough to be one of the companies who received it. So we're in phase 1 of that process. And so with both the public and the private sector validation, it certainly didn't make the seed fundraising process easy, but it certainly made it easier than probably a lot of companies are finding themselves in now, because we had market signal from both the public sector and the private sector. We had example of being able to turn and burn on a prototype really quickly, and we were very, very fortunate to partner with First Round Capital, with Bill Trenchard and the rest of the team at First Round, and they've just been an incredible. We call them like our Iron Man suit. Whenever there's something non-technical, not SBOM specific, but whether it's recruiting, hiring, business development, marketing, press relations, etc. They've got some terrific resources, and it's really helped accelerate our growth.
That's a great story, really, because people wonder how do I start something like this, and I think you gave people at least a little bit of insight. So now you've got some potential validation, right? I know these things are early stage, but you have some validation. You've got some money. You've probably gotten a couple of business processes and operations oriented, but now you're up and running. What's the short to midterm vision? Where do you expect to see this company go in the next few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. The trite answer is, more features, more customers, more users, more money. The real answer is, the space is evolving so quickly, and not to get too technical, but the kind of like sister artifact to SBOM is what's known as VEX, Vulnerability and Exploitability Exchange document. And so if the SBOM is the inventory of components, then you run it through, some sort of analytic capability to identify which of those components match to vulnerabilities. The VEX is kind of like a note that says, hey, we know that thing matches and it's not exploitable because, or it is exploitable because. So support for VEX. And then really what I meant what I said earlier about, integration beats innovation. Developing the enterprise grade capabilities, they're not sexy, right? They're not shiny. They don't make for really cool LinkedIn posts. But things like, role-based access control, things like multi-tenancy, things like integrations with the ticketing tools that I mentioned. Like, these are the things that make a capability valuable and sticky and irreplaceable. And what we're finding is that, particularly for our larger enterprise customers, those are the things that really carry the day. There's the SBOM generation and solicitation, whatever piece. There's the how well you built your UI and your API, which is terrific for the user experience. But it's really also the how well does this fit into my ecosystem, and so we're going to be investing heavily in that as well.
Sounds like you got the plan together for that.
Yeah, well, easy to say, hard to do, right?
Nothing that's worth doing is easy.
That's exactly it. And so, what we're finding, what makes me really excited is that when we started on this journey, we had, as I mentioned, we had a healthcare customer, design partner customer, and an aerospace customer, and the feature requests that we were getting were pretty disparate. One would say, hey, can you support like labeling for my assets? And one would say, hey, can you support, SSO for this? And what we're seeing now, particularly with the pilots and and our existing customer base, is that those feature requests are starting to coalesce. And so that is what gives me and Daniel a lot of confidence that our roadmap is true, is that, irrespective of whether or not the customer is in automotive, or the customer is in media, or the customer is in the Pentagon, we're seeing like the same sorts of, okay, cool, you do, 75 things really well. Like, what about this thing? And so that enables us to kind of like develop one feature that then unlocks outcomes for, a whole suite of different industry verticals. That's what's giving me confidence that we're kind of on the right path.
So you've alluded to this, but I want to get a little bit of clarity here, right? You've given us some insight into both the goals for development, as well as some of the customers, but what's the go-to-market strategy? Who is the ideal customer, the ICP, the ideal customer profile? What are you looking there? What are you looking at there?
Yeah, we learned really early on that it's really hard to make a double sale. It's hard to convince somebody of the value of SBOM and then subsequently the value of Manifest. It's much easier, more fruitful, more efficient, et cetera, to go after markets where SBOMs are being mandated.
Yep.
And so within the United States, you have Executive Order 14028, which stipulates if you want to sell software to the federal civilian government, you'll have to fork over an SBOM. The FDA just passed guidance that says if you're a medical device manufacturer and you want to get your medical device approved as of October, you'll have to fork over an SBOM. Within the EU, there's what's known as NIS2. There's the CRA, the Cyber Resiliency Act. So there's a groundswell of regulatory tailwinds. And so as opposed to trying to convince organizations that SBOMs are worthwhile and good hygiene and good practice and something they really ought to do, the ICP for us, at least in the short to medium term, is going to be large, industry, highly regulated, mission critical industry players in industries where SBOMs are being required, where you don't have a choice. The only choice you really have is whether or not you want that experience to be feature complete and workflow oriented and delightful and easy to use and well integrated, or whether you want to cobble together a handful of solutions, piecemeal. Being able to go to organizations that don't have, that have a immediate problem that needs to be solved, has enabled us to shorten sales cycles and ensure that we're meeting a need as opposed to creating a need and then meeting it afterwards.
Well, I got to say, from my exposure representing early stage startups from a recruitment standpoint, you guys seem to be ahead of the game. So I salute you for that.
I don't know if I would say that, but thank you.
You're doing well, right? I want to shift gears for a minute, Mark, because being a founder, it's not for everyone. And you mentioned you and your co-founder are first-time founders, right? So tell me about that. How, for example, a lot of people talk about imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Right. So has that afflicted you at all? If you're comfortable talking about it?
Sure.
Yeah. Is there a mental shift you have to make in your life to say, now I'm a founder, I'm a CEO?
Yeah. So first of all, imposter syndrome is a very real thing. Anybody who goes into this without imposter syndrome, I almost feel bad for. On the one hand, I'm like enormously jealous of, right, that you don't have this like big chip on your shoulder. But on the other hand, like I think it's a healthy paranoia. If you think that you've got the other, 799, 7,999,000,000 people on planet Earth, if you think you've got them all beat, there's something inherently unhealthy, I think, about that. So yes, we have massive imposter syndrome. We struggle with it every day. One of the things that was a real light bulb moment was actually very early on. Daniel and I were up, I don't know, 10:30, 10:45 at night. I had like the Met game on in the background. And we were going back and forth on Slack about logo ideas. We had like a handful of logo concepts that we were sifting through, and colors and whatever else. And every other time in my career, there's always been somebody you kicked the hard decision up to, right? There was always a director, a managing director, CFO, CTO, CIO, CEO, whoever, who made the hard decision, right? And like you could always just kind of like recognize it was a hard problem and then just kick it up to somebody else to make the final decision. And I realized as I was watching the Met game that like it was up to me and Daniel. It was our call. And that was an enormously empowering moment where this could be what we want it to be. The offsite activities are what we want it to be. The fonts that we use are what we want it to be. The product roadmap is what we want it to be. The go-to-market strategy is what we want it to be. The hiring decisions. And so, yes, there's a massive amount of imposter syndrome that comes with it, but it's also enormously empowering to realize this is going to be the truest, no pun intended, manifestation of mine and Daniel and the rest of the team's ability to execute. I'm not 1/8,000th of a company's output. I don't have like, some 0.001% impact on quarterly earnings. Like this is going to be the truest reflection of everything that I'm capable of doing, everything that Daniel's capable of doing, everything everybody else on the team is capable of doing. And I think I always knew, I wasn't going to retire having not tried this. And so we saw the market opportunity. We felt like we had the subject matter expertise, the opportunity, the regulatory tailwinds, and it felt like it was the right time for us to take the plunge. Have there been moments in the last 18 months or so where, I have said to myself, man, somebody else would be way better suited to do this than me? Of course. But on balance, I try to look back at, all we've accomplished so far and say, hey, generally speaking, we seem to be trending in the right direction.
I love the logo example. I went through that too when generating this one here.
I like Pinpoint. Yeah.
And to some people who haven't run a business, right? That's such a, could be considered such a minor detail, right? But it's those little minor details, in addition to the complexities of building a software that's going to be integrated into highly regulated environments. It's those little details that make owning and running your small business, your startup, really difficult, and having to own every aspect of it. So I relate. I bet you a lot of other people can. And for those considering jumping in, consider that, right? It's not just the big parts, the business, the sales. It's the little things like fonts and logos.
I have two quick little stories. So my wife's uncle, who's a successful entrepreneur many years ago, when I was talking to him about potentially taking the leap, he asked me, he said, how do you like staring at your ceiling? And I said, what do you mean? He goes, because, you'll be up at like 3 a.m. thinking about the business. He's like, I still remember that there was a crack in our ceiling where they were living, however many years ago. He's like, and I would just stare at that crack and I would mull over these problems. He's like, you have to be prepared to be able to do that. The other thing, and we mentioned the logo example, is, Daniel and I, we have enormous pride of ownership in what we're building. I remember the first time we demoed the hackiest, jankiest version of a prototype. And it was like showing people like pictures of my kids. I was so irrationally proud of showing them what I had, what we had done. And looking back on it now, when I look at like the screenshots of it, I'm like, man, like it was horrible, but I was incredibly proud of it. Daniel and I had one, like practically like a knockdown, drag out fight about a PowerPoint slide and about whether or not something should have been left justified versus center justified and like which one looked better. And it's like that obsession with the details, because we both want to make this, it's so important to both of us to see this succeed. If you don't have that, if you're of the like, it's good enough, let's move on to the next thing, like it's going to show in your fonts and your logo and your application and your integrations and your, data quality. And, you need to kind of have that commitment, that excitement, that passion for making something pixel perfect. Otherwise, it's folks are going to notice.
I love it. I love it. And so on that note, what do you tell other aspiring founders? Say, I'm thinking about it, right? I think you just gave us a little snippet here. Have that passion, be dedicated, focus on the details, but any other advice or wisdom to people considering doing what you're doing right now?
Yeah. I mean, this is with the exception of, being a dad, of course, like this is the hardest, wildest, most gratifying, most difficult, most challenging experience, I've ever had professionally. Being a founder is there's a real binary, like almost like a bipolar feel to it. You get one bit of positive reinforcement, one, customer prospect who says, wow, this is amazing. Or like, I want that. One customer who signs on the dotted line, and you're riding a high for the day. You get one bit of negative feedback or, one feature that gets delayed or, one bake off where they go with a competitor and, you're down in the dumps. So you really have to be able to kind of like moderate those swings, because unlike, a quote unquote, regular workaday 9 to 5 job where somebody providing feedback on a product is, they're providing it to a, 5,000 person company of which, you're 1/5,000th of, it ends up hitting, quite a bit more personally. And so I guess the advice, the recommendation, the feedback that I would have is like, you have to be ready to do this whole hog. This is going to become your life. Plenty of room for, personal stuff, being a dad, being a husband, being a friend. But this is going to be a more all-consuming thing than any other professional experience that you've had so far.
And I got to bring it up. You mentioned the personal component, right? So you made it crystal clear. You're fully dedicated to this business, but you obviously referenced your children. I'm a father of two young children as well. That's important to me as a business owner to be able to split that time. So is there anything that you do in your personal life? And it doesn't just have to be your children. Are there any hobbies, whatever it is, that you're comfortable talking about that you just kind of shut down work for a little bit, focus on enjoying life? What do you like to do?
Yeah. Hiking is real important to me. I find that I make better decisions when I've had an opportunity to get a little blood flowing and get exposure to, greenery and nature. It can be really tempting to just, sit here all day long and, make more slides or have more phone calls or more syncs with more team members. But I do find that like getting that, that endorphin kick really helps. My family and I, we just went to Iceland last week. Travel's been a really big part of our lives for actually, I mean, probably my entire life. It's really important for us to give our kids an exposure of, the wideness of the world, that not everything is America, not everything is dollars and cents, not everything is in English. And so being able to, disconnect a little bit, take them to some waterfalls, some glaciers, some icebergs. That was really important for me and my wife. We made that decision early on in our relationship that it was going to be a priority for us to share that with our kids. As a founder, that change, it's no longer disconnect completely. It happened to coincide with quarter end. There were some documents that needed to be signed. There were some, agreements that needed to be reviewed. There were still some things that I needed to do after the kids went down. So it wasn't like a complete disconnection. But yeah, I mean, I think anybody who thinks they're just going to start a company and then, sprint whole hog until, go 100 miles an hour until they reach some mythical finish line, I think, is not going to be setting themselves up for success. It really is a marathon, not a sprint. In terms of creating space, I have a little thing on my calendar. It's like a free, but, contact before scheduling window. I'm at the phase of my life right now where the most important thing to me is bath time. Bath time and bedtime with the kids. And so they're not going to remember whether we pushed a Vex integration, or a Vex capability or a, ServiceNow integration, I should say. But they are going to remember whether or not I read them Goodnight Moon, and, making sure that I make space for that wherever possible, right? It's not, when there's RSA, I go to RSA. When there's, a customer opportunity in Boston, I'm on a train up to Boston, but wherever possible, trying to make sure that, I'm there for them. Because, just like I'm building this company, I'm building them as well.
Yeah. And family first at the end of the day, right?
Totally.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
Mark, I got to tell you, this has been a legitimately fascinating conversation, not just because of how interesting SBOM is. And I'm not saying that as a joke. It's really interesting to know. And we all, to an extent, understand the explosion of software, but it's so interesting to understand how that hasn't really been categoried by so many large companies and the risks that are associated with not knowing what's in the software and that. But you were really humble enough to give us a real life preview of what it is to be a startup CEO. So I truly appreciate that candor, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys succeed. So we'll be watching. I appreciate you joining the Securing Success podcast, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Sounds great. Thanks very much for having me, Mark.
Excellent.